Well, after running the saw for a little while, we decided it actually performed so good I'd like to make it a little bit better, so next time I use it, it will be in a little bit better shape and I don't have to deal with some of the inconveniences that are remnants from the outdated parts that are in it. And one thing I'd like to do, because with this saw there's some things that I was unfamiliar with and I kind of wish I would have known, and so now I'm going to pass those along to you guys. A couple of unique things about this saw is the idle adjustment is actually this screw here, which is not very obvious to me. When I saw it in there, I really just had no idea what that does, or what it did, and I still don't know exactly what it looks like in there because I didn't have to take all this apart and I didn't have to learn that. But apparently this pushes down on the butterfly and the carburetor and then sets your idle. I'm used to it typically coming off the butterfly shaft where the linkage connects, and there's usually a tapered screw that goes in there that you turn in to turn it up and back it down. And for a while there I didn't recognize that this was the idle screw, and I was thinking, boy, did you have to bend the linkage to adjust the idle? And that would be not only hard, but it would, if it's something you got to do regularly, which seems like with these two strokes, rarely, as the temperatures change and conditions change, you always seem to always have to do something with them, either jets or idle. So bending a rod was just something I thought of, but I would have thought that was pretty unusual. So thankfully this is your idle screw adjustment and it works just as well as the other ones. The area here, which initially I thought could have been some sort of fuel pump, is really all that is an external screen and filter in there instead of having one inside the tank, which actually it does have what I believe is a coarser screen inside the tank, and then that comes up into this essentially filter separation bowl. And thankfully everything is intact. The gaskets are good, there's no cracks that I'm aware of, and it seems to be working okay. The big problem we have here is this carburetor, although it's Tillotson, and I'm sure that I don't know what model it is, and it doesn't really say on the top plate here, and I didn't have it apart, so I'm not, or upside down to see what other writing or information's on it, so I'm not sure exactly what model that is, and I'm not sure how hard it would be to put a choke butterfly in it. But this saw, like many of the later 60s and probably earlier, has a primer system on it, and I'm sure when that primer system was new it worked great. When I took this apart, the internals were, I don't know, either missing or just dissolved or disintegrated away. And I thought, well, if I can find a new one of these, which is, I'm finding out, is wishful thinking, I was hoping that I could find one that would still work and I could just replace it out. And I did come across one as new old stock on eBay. It's a Pioneer 471421 for part number reference for the guys that continue to look for these. And the guy that was selling these said they were new old stock, and he said he had no way of testing them to see if they actually worked. But the more I think about this, I think that was code for, I know they don't work, but good luck and take your chances, and I'll send one to you. The good news is there was one available. The bad news is when I took it apart, it just essentially was full of powder, and you can still see some of it here. The gasket material just flakes right off, and there's some white powder in here, there's oxidation, and there's some I think what's a check valve that goes into this brass piece. For a primer, it's pretty high quality materials, except for the plunger, soft goods, rubber components, which apparently degrade just even if you don't put fuel on them over the years, if these truly were new old stock, which I'm not sure. These were maybe pulling out of used saws, and the guy collected them and decided that they weren't going to do him any good, and they're non-repairable. Maybe you can find new internals. I looked a little bit, but just finding the whole assembly is tough, let alone replacement parts on the inside. And that's makes two of these now that we have that are not functioning. There's another video on YouTube, at least at the time I'm creating this video, where a guy retrofits, and I apologize, I don't remember who it was, and I should give him credit because it was a good idea. Essentially a primer for like your weed whips, or some of these smaller two-stroke, modern day two-strokes, and he substituted that in there, and it seemed like it was working. If you don't have some sort of primer or a choke flap, these things are pretty much impossible to get going without some sort of rich in fuel being applied. And I don't want to have to keep taking the cover off and filter out and squirting fuel in there to get it going, especially if it doesn't continue to run. Just got to keep doing it over and over until it gets running. Where if you have a working choke or primer, obviously they were put in for reasons. And what I found with this, at least this particular one, and if you get it, just a quick thing on the line connections, the low, if you hold it so the connections are pointing up, the one on the left is lower, so you can consider that your low pressure line or vacuum line, and then the taller one is your discharge or high pressure that puts the fuel into above your reeds there. What I believe is reeds. I didn't take any of that part, didn't have to, don't want to. And if we can get these then adapted to these lines, I believe this upper one ends up going to the reed connection, and then the lower one goes into the tank. I don't know if this is original. I'd be surprised. It looks like there's a smaller tube here. It's converted into a larger one. One of the problems we're going to have with this system is obviously these are bigger lines. Are, I think, I want to say 3/16 or 1/4 inch lines. I don't know for sure. These are much smaller, of course. We'll have to adapt those. Certainly can be done either with transitional hose barbs, or even kind of like they did here, which apparently works. You can put a tube inside of another one as long as it's tight fit, doesn't allow air in. On the vacuum side, that's a little more, or the low pressure side, that's a little more difficult. High pressure side, should have liquid in there. It should help seal versus pulling in air. And so the other nice thing about this is the bolt pattern, oddly enough, actually is the same or really close to the bolt pattern of the primer, the diagonals, which means that we'll bolt in there. So the easy thing is just to put this in there, bolt it in, and be done with it. Hook up your lines, away you go, and life is good. I'd like to keep, because the saw is in pretty good shape for its age, I'd like to keep it that way and make it look as original but yet functional. I believe we may be able to adapt this to fit this primer inside of this unit, which does a couple things. It makes it look still original, and also allows us to change this out as it degrades and fails over time, because these are readily available and they're really cheap. The plan is then to remove this brass, which would be the inlet or low pressure side of the primer, and then drill this out to let this bulb then pass through and then get pushed up against what's left of this plunger in here. And I'd really like to see what the original ones look like. There must have been some sort of piston, rubber piston or something in here that just completely disintegrated, or at least a rubber O-ring or something. I don't know, and I'm not going to try and guess what might have been in there, and I don't think I'm going to come up with the parts that are going to make this work. This may be harder than what I need to do, but I believe it'll work and we'll give it a shot. I don't plan on doing any modifications here, although it would be nice if this was a little more recessed in there. It sticks out a little bit more based on some initial measurements, but I'm going to try and leave that one the same. And then we'll bore this one out and then we'll allow the bulb to go in. So we'll get a measurement of this shoulder here, the black plastic diameter, and take and bore out this old original plunger once I remove the brass discharge valve. And then we'll see, we probably have to change our screw lengths too, because now we're going to have a longer screw area to get through, and we might actually have to put some spacers in between the primer and the original, or the new primer versus the original primer, just to make everything work out. We'll just have to see to get us our spacing so that this will continue to function and push on this bulb. And I think if we can pull that off, we can make it look fairly original. Maybe not so much on the inside, but at least on the outside it will look original. The good news is these primers, whatever plastic they used back then, probably something called like Bakelite, seems to have held up well over the years, and I believe it will continue to do so. Therefore, if we can get this working, we should have a pretty original looking saw, functional, and we'll continue to put it in service on occasion. Other than that, I can't tell you a whole lot about this. Whoever had the saw before me, I think they stored it correctly. They had it dialed in, adjusted correctly. Maybe it was even from the factory that way. I didn't really have to do too much. I think I opened the low speed adjustment at first, and then as I ran it more, I ended up closing it back down. Played with the idle a little bit, and it's pretty good idling saw. Tends to kind of stay running for the most part, more than what I'm typically used to for these older saws. And being OMC origin and having some experience with the Evinrude and Johnson snowmobiles, those are one of the few snowmobiles I've seen of the late 60s, early 70s, very early 70s, where the engines, you can start them up and walk away and come back in 10 or 15 minutes, they're still idling. And that's a rarity, especially if you own any of the early or similar dated Kawasaki or Arctic Cat snowmobiles that use Kawasaki engines. It seems like if you're not on the throttle on those things, they're stalling out within 20 or 30 seconds. And maybe it's just I've had bad luck with those, but the Johnsons and Evinrudes seem to be better for that. So we'll go ahead and see what we can do, see if we can get this to adapt, and if we can, we'll work on the hoses after we see if we can get this part together, and looks like we have hope. On this particular primer, the OD of this shoulder is about 0.83, which is slightly over a 13/16 and slightly under a 7/8 drill bit. So we'll start out, we'll see how the 13/16 goes. I'd like to not remove any more than I have to out of there, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to go to the 7/8. Alright, so I made a little bit of a mistake, but it's going to help you guys if you do this. Really, you only need to drill it big enough for the bulb. because this is going to have to be set back so that the plunger can actually have some travel to push that in. We don't have to have this base tight against the original primer. In fact, we don't want that. I'm seeing now. And the diameter of this clear part is about 5/8 or 0.6 inches. That's all you would really need to drill out. And we'll, in fact, that would probably help a lot. We'll be able to compensate for that. It's okay that we drilled it a little bit larger, although it would have been nice if I didn't do that. But we'll put some spacers in there to step this back off a little bit, and then we'll put our bolts through and secure that. I think we got everything we need. I just took these parts to the store and found the screws and plan, I guess, at the kind of put together at the store. But what I came up with here, and this is, I'm not saying this is the only way, but this is a way. These are 632 socket head cap screws, and originally I was gonna try and find a sleeve to put in there instead of the nuts, but the nuts I think work good. In fact, I originally wanted a nut on either side in between the new priming bulb and the old priming bulb casing, but the fit on these holes is not, you can see where the bolts are a little bit tapered, so these really should be either drilled out a little bit or slotted, because although they're close, they are not the same. So I may do that yet, just to make that a little bit better fit on there. It should slide on easy, and it's not, but at the same time it's probably not hurting anything. It would work. So these are 632 socket head cap screws. You don't have to get socket head cap screws, but that's what I chose just to find that length. Most of the 632 were less than 3/4 of an inch, and you need at least an inch. These are 1.25 inches. I'm going to try and swap them out with the I'm sorry, these are 1.5 inches, and this one here is 1.25 inches. I'm going to try and swap that out, or at least these, that's what I remember, these being 1.25 inches. Let's see, as I'm getting older, my memory is getting shorter. Oh, they're only 1 inch. Sorry, so these are 1 inch long, and these are 1 1/4. So certainly 1 1/4 will work. One would be a little bit cleaner, as long as we can get the lock nuts on. And I just chose those to because they're only a couple cents more than the regular nuts and can help eliminate that loosening on you. The good news with this assembly is if it does come loose, everything's contained in the new primer, and so you don't need to really, if it comes apart, it's not that big a deal. It's not like you have fuel leaking everywhere. So that was kind of what I decided to do. The other thing I noticed when I put this together is these nuts are a little bit too big in diameter, and they hit up against the plastic housing of the new primer. And I may have to grind a little more off one of these flats to get that to go in more. From the looks of it, it seems like it's working. I'm not getting the full stroke with the plunger that I'd like to, so I could try and bring that a little bit closer, at least 1/8 of an inch or so closer, and that would give me more fuel per push of the button. But I think even in this form it would work fine. The other thing that I'm using in this case, I don't know if these lines, as I mentioned earlier, are original or not. I'm just kind of running with what we have. This is some, I want to say 3/32 tie gun and maybe 1/16. of an inch on the ID, or it may be a metric size, I don't know. It just happens to fit. It will actually fit inside the tubing that's on here, the hose. Not super easily, but I've had it go in. And so that's something that you'll want to put on here, as well as a couple pieces of this essentially bushing tubing. And then those lines will hook up. Other than that, I don't know what else. There's not much more to this. This actually seems to work out better than I originally thought it was going to. I'll probably even put I won't put the old check valve assembly completely back together, but at least I'll put the screw in to make it look as original as I can, even though it's going to be a little bit obvious to the trained eye that this is not original. But we're shooting for functionality here, and as long as you don't have to go in underneath the air cleaner cover, you may not notice. Let's go ahead and get it together. You'll have to, it will not fit, either it'll have to be assembled in pieces here, or this nozzle in front of the carburetor needs to come off. I think I'm just going to take this nozzle off, because I'm not even sure, even if you disassemble this with these screws in here, these have to be together before you put this assembly in there, I think. And there's just not enough room to do that. So we'll get this off, we'll get this in here, things hooked up, and I'll let you know what I decided to do on these nuts in the end. And I may go back to actually putting a nut on this side too. It works as an adjuster, so it can set the distance, and you can dial that in to get the full stroke of the plunger into the new primer. Alright, so I have put the smaller screws in, and instead of grinding on the nut, I actually just ground a little bit on the plastic on each side with the grinding wheel. I tried to take a file to it, but my file must be dull. And that actually allowed it to set in quite well, and we're getting a full stroke of the old primer onto the new one now. Makes it actually look a little more compact. There's a little bit of a gap yet right here, and you could put a washer in there, I guess, if that's what you wanted to do, but really it's not going to go that way anymore because of the plunger on the new primer. And the smaller bolts are about the right size at 1 inch. And now we can put this assembly back in. I just swung the inlet to the carb. I don't know if you'd call that a intake manifold or what. Somebody can correct me on that one. But that gave us the room we need to get this in. So get it in the right position here. And put the original screws back in, which I guess are in the old plunger. I'll have to keep those. The old primer, I should say. I suspect these are 632 as well, although I didn't check them. They are a little bit longer than the screws that hold the body together, by about 1/4 of an inch, I would say. And this screw underneath on the bottom is a real kind of a tough one to get into, or a little tougher than the other one, I guess. But it goes. I'm not sure if it's best to go on top of the throttle lock or below it. Looks like on top's fine. And since these bolts apparently hold the carburetor on, we want to make sure they're pretty tight. And I actually should use a bigger screwdriver, but I don't have one handy. So we'll take our chances with that. I can always snug them up later if we suspect a problem. Okay, so short end of the primer is the low pressure or the fuel tank line. Alright, got our bushing back. It's actually on one of the other primer bulbs. Now we'll get our discharge line hooked up, or the high pressure side. It is a little bit loose. Actually, it probably wouldn't hurt for me just to nip that off and then get on to some. Although I think it's tight enough, though. I'm gonna leave it for now. If it causes an issue, might have to go back and do it, but for now it'll work. Same thing with the vacuum side. Now the problem with this, because it does fit in better than I was expecting, I can't see if there's any fuel in there, and that's a problem. So to remedy that, put the longer bolts in, put spacers in here. Of course, you won't have quite the same plunger stroke, but at least you could see the primer. But of course, back when this was original, you couldn't see anything either. And this line is clear, so it does show something, but I don't see anything happening there. I guess we can pop this off, and this line's in pretty rough shape too. I actually had to cut it down already because there was a crack in it. We'll just kind of, hopefully, if we can pop this off easily and not wreck it, we'll see if we're getting any fuel coming out of here, since we really have no way of telling what's going on with the bulb anymore on the new primer. And if things are working the way they should, or at least the way they're anticipated to work, we should be able to get some fuel coming out of here. Try and catch it there. Expect the best case. Yep. There we go. So let's hook this up, give it a few pumps, and see if we can get it to start now off of our converted primer. Now the question is how many pumps should it be given to get this thing to start? And my experience with these older chainsaws, they tend to be pretty thirsty. And since that new primer is nothing more than a weed whacker primer, which doesn't hold a lot of fuel or push a lot of fuel, I'm going to try 6 or 7 pumps to begin with, and then we'll kind of go from there. So we'll set our throttle lock. We'll pump in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Did I say 6 or 7? Probably won't matter much. Make sure our switch is on, throttle lock, and prior to this, if I show it in the video, the squirting fuel in the carb tends to take a while to get into the cylinder for some reason. I don't know why, but it was 6 or 7 pulls. We'll see what this does. So I think we'll stick with that. 6 or 7 pumps seem to do okay. Actually started much quicker than putting it down the throttle of the carburetor. And so success so far. We'll see how long it lasts. Let's see if it'll start without the primer now. Chainsaw guy has a lot of videos out, as you guys are probably aware, and I always used to see him pull the recoil before he shut it off, and I always wondered why that was. And I ended up picking up a McCulloch Pro Max 700 that appears to be never run, and the flywheel was broken on it, and I believe somebody just parked it on a shelf after that. But what I suspect happened is when that saw, the Pro Max 700 is somewhat of a high compression saw, and if you shut it off with the recoil retracted, you can have the engine stop in a position where the compression actually kicks it back in reverse, and because the handle's not allowing it to go, it can either break the recoil, or in this case looks like it broke the flywheel. At least that's why I believe the chainsaw guy always pulled that out a little bit when he shut it off, just to prevent that, because you'll feel it when you pull it out and shut it off. It'll actually roll back and reverse half a turn or so, and it'll pull that slack in, and if it can't go in, something's going to bind or break. And I mentioned I would say the serial number on here. Look at that tag, it looks almost brand new. Model 2400, serial number 545699. Has an Illinois, mention USA, Galesburg, made in Peterborough, Canada. If I said that right. If I didn't, I apologize to the Canadians. But otherwise, nice saw. So we'll finish up our job with this and then get it stored away, and maybe it'll be in good shape for the next guy, which will probably be me someday.